In the dark theater of the human mind, there exists a character we both fear and find fascinating: the master criminal. This is the architect of the perfect crime, a figure of intellect so profound, of planning so meticulous, that they move like a ghost through society, leaving behind only chaos and questions. They are the Moriartys, the Lecters, the Phantoms who seem to operate on a plane of existence far beyond the reach of ordinary law enforcement. This archetype, perpetuated by fiction and romanticized in hushed tones, suggests a world where evil possesses a kind of genius. It implies that to catch such a monster, one needs a hero of equal or greater intellect, a Sherlock Holmes to unravel the impossibly complex web. We are drawn to the idea of a grand battle of wits, a chess match played with human lives, where every move is calculated and every outcome is foreseen. But this is, for the most part, a comforting lie. The chilling reality of history's most monstrous murderers is often far more mundane, far more pathetic. The truth is that the downfall of these so-called geniuses is rarely orchestrated by a single brilliant detective deducing a microscopic clue. More often than not, they are the authors of their own destruction, brought down not by a stroke of brilliance, but by a moment of breathtaking stupidity. It is the fatal flaw of hubris, the corrosive acid of ego that dissolves the most carefully laid plans. They believe they are smarter, faster, and more deserving than everyone else, the police, their victims, the world. And in that cavernous space of their own self-regard, they make mistakes. Not small, forgivable errors, but colossal, case-breaking blunders born of arrogance, carelessness, or a simple, shocking lack of common sense. This is a journey into that abyss of arrogance. We will explore 15 instances where the mask of the master criminal slipped, revealing the foolish, fallible human beneath. These are the stories of murderers who were not caught by elaborate stings or futuristic technology, but by things as simple as a parking ticket, a boast to a friend, or a misplaced piece of paper. They are cautionary tales of how the grandest schemes of murder can be unraveled by the smallest, most idiotic of threads. We will dissect the psychology of their errors, peering into the moments where their self-proclaimed genius failed them. We will see how a desperate need for recognition drove them to taunt the very people hunting them, how a flash of greed led them to use a victim's credit card, and how a stunning lack of foresight had them literally caught with their hands dirty. These are not tales of brilliant detectives. They are tales of dumb criminals who just happen to be murderers. From the foggy streets of Edwardian London to the sun-baked suburbs of modern California, the pattern repeats. Technology changes, investigative techniques evolve, but the one constant, the one reliable variable in the equation of justice is the criminal's capacity to make a fatal mistake. They meticulously plan the act of taking a life, but give little thought to the mundane realities of the world they still inhabit. So, prepare to dismantle the myth of the criminal mastermind. Prepare to witness how the most intricate plots were foiled by the most basic of human failings. This is the story of how evil, in its infinite pride, inevitably trips over its own feet. This is the story of 15 stupid mistakes that exposed some of the most famous murderers the world has ever known. Our journey begins not in the modern age of digital forensics, but in a time of steamships and telegraphs, in the heart of London, 1910. It is a world where science was beginning to creep into the police station, but justice still often relied on intuition, legwork, and, as we shall see, a murderer's bafflingly poor judgment. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen was, by all appearances, a mild-mannered American homeopath living a quiet life in North London. He was a man of medicine, seemingly dedicated to healing. Yet, beneath this placid exterior was a man trapped in a deeply unhappy marriage. A man whose simmering resentment was about to boil over into a crime that would make him infamous across the globe. His wife, Cora Turner, who went by the stage name Belle L. Moore, was a struggling music hall singer with aspirations of stardom that far outstripped her talent. She was described as flamboyant, demanding, and openly dismissive of her quiet husband. Their home at 39 Hilldrop Crescent was a place of tension, a stage for Cora's dramatic outbursts and Crippen's silent suffering. In this strained domestic environment, Dr. Crippen found solace in the arms of another woman, his young typist, Ethel Leneve. Their affair was the catalyst, the final ingredient in a toxic brew of marital discontent. Crippen dreamed of a new life with Ethel, a life free from the shadow of his overbearing wife. But divorce was a scandalous and difficult proposition in Edwardian society. Crippen, it seemed, chose a more permanent solution. On the evening of January 31, 1910, the Crippens hosted a dinner party for friends. After the guests departed, Cora Turner was never seen alive again. In the days and weeks that followed, Dr. Crippen began to spin a web of lies. He told friends that Cora had returned to the United States to care for a sick relative. Later, his story changed. She had tragically fallen ill and died in California. To sell his story, he placed a death notice in the newspapers and went about his life, now openly with Ethel Leneve at his side. The first flicker of suspicion was ignited by a simple yet telling detail. Ethel began wearing Cora's jewelry, a bold and careless act that did not go unnoticed by Cora's friends. It was this act of brazen replacement that led one of them to contact Scotland Yard. Chief Inspector Walter Dew was assigned to the case. He was a seasoned detective, known for his methodical approach. On July 8th, he visited 39 Hilldrop Crescent to interview Dr. Crippen. Crippen, ever calm and collected, stuck to his story about Cora's death in America, but with a new, crucial admission. He had lied about it to avoid the embarrassment of her having left him. Dew was not entirely convinced, but after a search of the house yielded nothing, he had little to go on. He thanked the doctor and left, planning to continue his inquiries. For any murderer who had just successfully bluffed a chief inspector from Scotland Yard, this should have been a moment for quiet confidence. The police had come, searched, and left empty-handed. The path was clear. But this is where Dr. Crippen made his first, truly monumental mistake, a mistake born not of cunning, but of pure, unadulterated panic. Instead of staying put and maintaining his story, he decided to run. The very next day, he and Ethel Leneve, now disguised as his young son, fled London, first to Brussels and then to Antwerp, where they booked passage to Canada aboard the SS Montrose. Their flight immediately transformed a routine missing persons inquiry into a high-profile manhunt. Inspector Dew, returning to Hilldrop Crescent for a follow-up interview, found the house empty. Now certain of foul play, he ordered a second, far more thorough search of the property. This time, the officers were not just looking, they were tearing the house apart. Under the flagstones of the coal cellar, they found what they were looking for. Buried in the dirt was a dismembered human torso. The head, limbs, and bones had been removed, making identification nearly impossible. The remains were treated with quicklime in a crude attempt to accelerate decomposition. It was a gruesome but seemingly anonymous discovery. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away on the Atlantic, Dr. Crippen was making another series of foolish errors. He and Ethel, disguised as Mr. Robinson and Son, were drawing unwanted attention. The captain of the SS Montrose, Henry George Kendall, found their behavior odd. The father and son were unusually affectionate, holding hands in a manner that struck him as peculiar for the time. Captain Kendall's suspicions grew. He remembered seeing news reports of the wanted Dr. Crippen and his companion. Using a technology that was then in its infancy, he sent a wireless telegraph message to the British authorities. Have strong suspicions that Crippen, London cellar murderer, and accomplice are amongst saloon passengers. It was a landmark moment. the first time wireless communication was used to apprehend a fugitive at sea. Back in London, the investigation into the human remains was reaching a critical juncture. The brilliant pathologist Bernard Spilsbury was tasked with examining the gruesome discovery from the cellar. Amidst the decomposing flesh, he found a small fragment of fabric. It appeared to be from a man's pajama top, and on it was a tiny faded label. This was the killer's ultimate, stupid mistake. Not the flight, not the poor disguise, but the failure to dispose of every last shred of evidence. In his haste to dismember and destroy the body of his wife, Dr. Crippen had overlooked this tiny piece of cloth. The label was from the manufacturer, Jones Bros, and it bore a specific inventory number. Investigators traced the label. They discovered that the pajamas had been purchased from a specific store on a specific date in 1909. They had evidence that directly linked the remains in the cellar to a purchase made by the Crippens. More damningly, the fragment contained a scar consistent with an abdominal surgery Cora was known to have had. Crippen's story of her being alive and well in America was not just a lie, it was now an impossibility. Armed with this irrefutable link, Inspector Dew boarded a faster ship, the SS Laurentic, determined to intercept the Montrose before it reached Canada. The world watched, captivated by the real-time drama unfolding across the ocean, a chase broadcast through daily telegraph updates. Dew arrived in Quebec first, boarding the Montrose disguised as a pilot. He approached the unsuspecting doctor on deck and said calmly, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. I am Chief Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard." Crippen, his composure finally shattering, reportedly replied, "Thank God it's over." The chase had ended. The trial that followed was a media sensation, and the star witness was not a person, but that small, damning piece of pajama fabric. Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, the man who thought he could get away with murder by simply erasing his wife from existence, was undone by a souvenir he didn't even know he had kept. He had meticulously planned her death and disposal, but had failed in the most basic task of a cleanup. That single, overlooked scrap of cloth was a tangible piece of his lie, a silent testament to his crime that shouted louder than any of his denials. He was found guilty and hanged, his name forever synonymous with a new era of forensic detection and a classic fatal blunder. Crippen's panic-induced flight and his careless disposal of the body highlight a common theme among killers, a profound failure to appreciate the significance of the mundane. They focus so intently on the grand, horrific act of murder that they overlook the simple, everyday details that will ultimately ensnare them. This brings us to our next category of mistake, where the elaborate cat-and-mouse game of a manhunt is brought to a sudden, anticlimactic end by a minor, everyday infraction. Imagine a killer so elusive, so terrifying, that he becomes a national bogeyman. He crosses state lines, leaving a trail of victims, his identity a complete mystery. The FBI is on the case, police departments are on high alert, and the public is gripped by fear. Now, imagine that this very same phantom, this architect of chaos, is brought to a halt by something as simple as a routine traffic stop. This is precisely what happened to one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, a man whose name became a byword for predatory evil, Ted Bundy. Bundy cultivated an image of intellectual superiority. He was a law student, handsome, charming, and articulate. He was the monster who didn't look like a monster, which made him all the more terrifying. Between 1974 and 1978, Bundy embarked on a murderous rampage that spanned at least 7 states. He was a meticulous predator, often using a ruse, like faking an injury and wearing a cast, to lure his victims into a position of vulnerability. He was careful, he was clever, and for a long time, he was a ghost. The only link between the disparate crimes was a vague description of a man and his Volkswagen Beetle. By August of 1975, Bundy was living in the Salt Lake City area, attending law school at the University of Utah. He was, by this point, a seasoned killer, confident in his ability to evade capture. He had killed in Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. He was at the height of his monstrous career, and his arrogance was growing with every successful crime. In the early morning hours of August 16, 1975, in the quiet suburb of Granger, Utah, Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward was on a routine patrol. It was around 2:30 a.m., a time when the streets are typically deserted. Hayward noticed a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle cruising slowly through a residential neighborhood, its headlights off, then on, then off again. To the patrolman, this was suspicious behavior. It suggested a burglar casing houses, looking for an easy target. He decided to pull the car over. This was not a dramatic takedown or the culmination of a long investigation. It was a simple, precautionary traffic stop, the kind of thing that happens hundreds of times a night across the country. When Sergeant Hayward approached the vehicle, he found a clean-cut, handsome young man behind the wheel. It was Ted Bundy. Bundy, ever the manipulator, tried to use his charm to talk his way out of the situation. He provided a plausible, if slightly flimsy, explanation for his presence in the neighborhood. He was lost, he said, after watching a movie. But Hayward's instincts told him something was wrong. Bundy seemed nervous, and his story didn't quite add up. The officer asked for permission to search the car. Bundy, likely realizing that a refusal would only heighten suspicion, reluctantly agreed. What Hayward found inside the unassuming VW Beetle was anything but ordinary. It was what investigators would later call a kill kit. There was a crowbar, a ski mask, rope, an ice pick, and a pair of handcuffs. These were not the tools of a lost moviegoer. They were the instruments of a predator. Bundy tried to explain them away as innocuous items, but the collection was too sinister, too specific. This was the mistake. It was a lapse in judgment born of pure arrogance. Bundy, the supposed criminal genius, was out hunting for his next victim, and he did so in a way that screamed suspicious. Driving slowly through a neighborhood with your lights off is a universal sign of trouble, a beacon for any patrol officer. He had become so confident, so sure of his own invisibility, that he had forgotten the most basic rule of committing a crime: don't attract attention. The arrest in Granger didn't immediately solve the string of murders, but it was the first critical tear in the veil of anonymity that had protected him for so long. It put Ted Bundy, the law student, on law enforcement's radar. Police now had his name, his photograph, and his car. They had a tangible link, a person to investigate. From that single stupid mistake, the case against him began to build. Detectives from other states began to see connections. A gas receipt found in his car placed him in Colorado around the time of a murder there. A victim who had escaped an abduction attempt in Utah identified him in a lineup. The dominoes began to fall, all because a seasoned killer got careless and was pulled over for driving like a common burglar. Even after he was convicted of kidnapping and escaped custody twice, his downfall was again precipitated by a mundane encounter with law enforcement. His final capture in Pensacola, Florida in 1978 occurred after a police officer ran the plates on a stolen car he was driving. The grand, terrifying saga of Ted Bundy, the phantom who haunted a nation, ended not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs, a consequence of his repeated failure to master the simple art of blending in. Bundy's story is a powerful example, but he is not alone. The annals of crime are filled with killers whose reigns of terror were ended by similar moments of banal carelessness. Just 2 years after Bundy's first arrest, the city of New York was in the grip of a panic so profound it changed the very fabric of city life. A lone gunman was stalking the streets, targeting young couples in parked cars, and his only calling card was the powerful .44 caliber bulldog revolver he used. He called himself the Son of Sam. For over a year, from the summer of 1976 to the summer of 1977, David Berkowitz waged a campaign of terror against the city. He was a shadow, striking at random and melting back into the urban landscape. He added a psychological dimension to his crimes by sending bizarre, taunting letters to the police and to newspaper columnist Jimmy Breslin, creating a media frenzy. The Son of Sam task force was one of the largest in NYPD history. Detectives pursued thousands of leads, but the killer remained elusive. He seemed to be a ghost, a nobody who could be anywhere. The city held its breath, with young people avoiding discos and lovers' lanes, the vibrant nightlife of New York muted by fear. The final attack occurred on July 31, 1977 in Brooklyn. Stacy Moskowitz was killed, and Robert Violante was blinded in one eye. It was another tragic, senseless act. But this time, the killer made a mistake. It was a mistake so small, so utterly trivial, that it's almost laughable in the context of the citywide terror he had created. As Berkowitz fled the scene of his final crime, a local resident named Cecilia Davis was out walking her dog. She noticed the man near a cream-colored Ford Galaxy that was parked unusually near a fire hydrant. A few moments later, she heard the gunshots. She also noticed something else. A police officer was issuing a parking ticket to the illegally parked car. This was it. This was the fatal flaw. David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam, the monster who had brought the greatest city in the world to its knees, had gotten a parking ticket. In the midst of carrying out a murder, his mind focused on his dark fantasies and his deadly weapon. He had failed to consider the mundane rules of the road. He had parked illegally. When police canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses, Cecilia Davis told them about the man and the ticketed car. At first, it was just one lead among many. But as other avenues dried up, detectives began the laborious process of tracking down every single parking summons issued in that part of Brooklyn that night. It was a needle in a haystack search. Eventually, they found it. A ticket issued to a 1970 Ford Galaxy registered to one David Berkowitz of Yonkers, a suburb just north of the city. The name meant nothing at first, but as they looked into him, pieces began to fit. He was a postal worker, a quiet loner. And when they went to his apartment building, they saw the car, the same Ford Galaxy that had been ticketed. Inside the car, in plain view, was a rifle bag. The trap was closing. On August 10, 1977, as Berkowitz left his apartment, detectives surrounded him. He reportedly smiled and said, "Well, you got me." The reign of the Son of Sam was over. The key that unlocked the case, the clue that ended a year of terror for 8 million people, was not a brilliant forensic discovery or a deep psychological profile. It was a $15 parking ticket, a piece of paper left on a windshield because a killer couldn't be bothered to find a legal parking spot. Both Bundy and Berkowitz, men who saw themselves as powerful, godlike figures, were ultimately undone by their contempt for the small, ordinary rules of society. Their belief that they were above it all, that the mundane world of traffic laws and parking regulations didn't apply to them, was the very thing that brought them crashing down to earth. Their stories serve as a stark reminder that sometimes the most effective weapon against a monster is a simple, unassuming rulebook. This overwhelming sense of superiority, this deep-seated narcissism, often manifests in another classic, self-destructive mistake: the compulsion to taunt the authorities. Some killers are not content to merely commit their crimes in secret. They crave recognition, they need an audience, and they see the investigation not as a threat, but as a game. They write letters, they make phone calls, they reach out to the media, all in an effort to prove how much smarter they are than everyone else. This brings us to the man who gave himself a name, and then, decades later, handed police the instructions on how to find him. For 30 years, the city of Wichita, Kansas, lived with a dark legend. It was the story of the BTK killer, a name the murderer himself had coined. It stood for bind, torture, kill, the brutal signature he left upon his victims. Between 1974 and 1991, he killed 10 people, terrorizing the community with his seemingly random and vicious attacks. What set BTK apart was his brazen communication. He sent letters to local news stations and police, letters filled with chilling details of his crimes, crude poems, and puzzles. He took credit for his work, demanding the attention he felt he deserved. He was playing a game, and for a long time, he was winning. After his last known murder in 1991, he went silent. The case went cold, and BTK faded from a terrifying reality into a chilling piece of local folklore. Then, in 2004, after 13 years of silence, he resurfaced. The catalyst was a local newspaper article that marked the 30th anniversary of his first murders and speculated that he was either dead or in prison. This, it seems, was an insult his monumental ego could not endure. He needed to prove he was still out there, still in control. And so, the game began again. He started sending packages to the media. Inside were items taken from his victims, like a driver's license and new letters filled with his trademark arrogance. He was back in the spotlight, and he was reveling in it. The Wichita police, now armed with 21st century technology, were cautiously optimistic. The killer's need for attention could be his undoing. This new wave of communication was a cat-and-mouse game. BTK was testing the police, trying to see what he could get away with. He was a man from a different era of technology, a man whose understanding of forensics was stuck in the 1970s. He was about to make a mistake so perfectly ironic it almost seemed scripted. In one of his communications, he asked the police a direct question, a question that would seal his fate. He wanted to know if he could send them a floppy disk with his writings on it and whether it could be traced back to him. It was a moment of profound technological ignorance mixed with pure hubris. He was literally asking his pursuers for advice on how to remain anonymous. The police saw their opening. It was a chance to lay a perfect trap. They responded to his query through a classified ad in the local newspaper, as he had instructed. The message was simple and deceptive. "Rex, it will be okay." They lied. They assured him that a floppy disk would be a safe way to communicate. It was the reassurance he needed. BTK, believing he had outsmarted the police once again, prepared his next package. He copied a letter onto a 1.44 megabyte floppy disk, the kind that was already becoming obsolete in 2005. He placed it in a package and mailed it to the KSAS television station in Wichita. On February 16, 2005, the package arrived. Inside was the floppy disk. For the investigators, it was a moment of breathless anticipation. They handed the disk over to their forensic computer experts, who immediately went to work. What they found was the digital equivalent of a signed confession. BTK had made a laughably simple error. He had written the letter on the disk and then deleted the file, thinking that would be enough to erase his tracks. But anyone with basic computer knowledge knows that deleting a file doesn't actually remove it. The data remains until it is overwritten. The forensics team easily recovered the deleted Microsoft Word document. But the true gold mine was not in the text of the document itself, but in its metadata. Embedded in the file's properties, invisible to the casual user, was a digital breadcrumb trail. The metadata showed that the document was last modified by a user named Dennis. It also contained the name of the institution where the computer was located, Christ Lutheran Church. Suddenly, the 30-year-old phantom had a first name and a location. Investigators quickly searched the church's website and found their man. The president of the church council was named Dennis Rader. It was a stunning revelation. The monster who had haunted Wichita for 3 decades was not some shadowy drifter, but a seemingly ordinary family man, a church leader, a Boy Scout troop leader. They needed to be sure. They obtained a warrant to test the DNA of Rader's daughter from a pap smear she had on file at a university clinic. They compared it to the DNA found under the fingernails of one of BTK's victims from 1986. It was a familiar match. They had him. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over during his lunch break and arrested. The game was over. His downfall was a direct result of his own inflated ego. His need to taunt, to play, to prove his superiority led him to trust his enemies and to use a piece of technology he fundamentally misunderstood. He asked the police for the rope, and they happily handed it to him. The man who named himself BTK was ultimately caught by a file named Doc1.Doc. This underestimation of technology is a recurring theme in modern crime, a digital pitfall for killers who fail to realize that in the 21st century, every action can leave a trace. The digital world has become a vast, invisible witness, recording our movements, our communications, and our secrets. For a murderer, it presents a minefield of potential mistakes, as our next two cases vividly illustrate. In the early 2000s, the internet was still a relatively new frontier for many. The concept of a persistent digital footprint was not as deeply ingrained in the public consciousness as it is today. For some criminals, this new technology seemed like the perfect tool for anonymous communication, a way to play games with the police from the safety of their homes. This was the fatal assumption made by a serial killer in St. Louis, Missouri. Maury Travis was a predator who preyed on sex workers. He would lure them to his home in Ferguson, a suburb of St. Louis, where he had constructed a torture chamber in his basement. He recorded his horrific acts, documenting the suffering of his victims. He was a monster living a double life, a quiet restaurant waiter who harbored the darkest of secrets. Like BTK, Travis had an undeniable ego and a desire to see his crimes acknowledged. He wanted to instill fear, to let the world know that a monster was in their midst. In 2002, he decided to reach out. He sent an anonymous letter to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, a letter that contained a clue to the location of one of his victims. Included in the letter was a map. It was a crudely drawn, computer-generated map pointing to a specific location in a park. He was taunting the police, daring them to find the body. It was a classic move from the arrogant killer's playbook. But Travis, in his hubris, made a critical technological error. The map had been created using an early online mapping service, Expedia.com. When the newspaper turned the letter over to the police, investigators looked closely at the printout. What Travis failed to realize was that the map he had printed contained more than just streets and landmarks. In the corner, in small print, was a unique URL, a web address specific to the map he had generated. This unique identifier was the digital equivalent of a fingerprint. It was a direct link back to a specific session on the Expedia servers. The St. Louis Cybercrimes Unit contacted the company, and with the unique URL, Expedia's technicians were able to trace the request back to its source. They identified the specific IP address that had been used to create the map. An IP address, or Internet Protocol address, is a numerical label assigned to each device connected to a computer network. While not always a direct line to a person's home, it provides a crucial link to an Internet service provider. The investigators traced the IP address to a specific account, an account belonging to Maury Travis's mother, with whom he lived. On a quiet morning in June 2002, a SWAT team descended on the suburban home. Travis, taken completely by surprise, was arrested. In the basement, they found his homemade torture chamber, exactly as it had been described in a diary he kept. They found the videotapes of his crimes. The evidence was overwhelming. Travis, who thought he was being clever by using the anonymity of the internet, had been exposed by the very tool he had tried to weaponize. He had no understanding of how the digital world worked, no concept of the invisible trails of data that he was leaving behind. A few days after his arrest, before he could be brought to trial, Maury Travis hanged himself in his jail cell. His digital ghost had come back to haunt him. Travis's mistake was one of ignorance about how the internet records our actions. A decade later, another, even more terrifying killer would be caught by a different kind of digital trail, one not of creation, but of consumption. This was a man who understood the need for anonymity, a man who went to extraordinary lengths to avoid leaving a trace, but was ultimately undone by a simple, everyday financial transaction. Israel Keyes was a new breed of serial killer. He was not a regional predator tied to a specific area. He was a ghost who traveled the country, a meticulous planner who would fly to a city, rent a car, and drive hundreds of miles to a different location to commit his crimes. He had no victim profile. He killed men, women, and couples at random. He buried kill kits all over the United States years in advance, containing weapons, zip ties, and tools for body disposal. Keyes was terrifyingly patient and disciplined. He had no connection to his victims, making his crimes nearly impossible to link or solve. He operated in the shadows for over a decade, a phantom collecting bodies across the nation, from Vermont to Washington to Alaska. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the perfect, untraceable killer. In February 2012, his meticulous system began to unravel. In Anchorage, Alaska, he abducted an 18-year-old barista named Samantha Koenig from the coffee stand where she worked. He took her to a shed, sexually assaulted and murdered her, and then left her body there while he went on a pre-planned 2-week cruise with his family. Upon his return, he engaged in a particularly gruesome deception. He posed Koenig's body with a recent newspaper to create a fake proof-of-life photo, which he used to demand a ransom from her family. He instructed them to deposit money into an account linked to her debit card. After the money was deposited, he dismembered her body and disposed of it in a frozen lake. This is where Keyes, the master of anonymity, made a series of uncharacteristically stupid mistakes. He had the victim's debit card and the PIN. The temptation of easy money was too much to resist. He began to use the card. It was a direct, traceable link between him and the missing girl, a link he had so carefully avoided in all his other crimes. He left Alaska and began a road trip down to the lower 48, using Samantha Koenig's card at ATMs along the way. He first used it in Arizona, then in New Mexico, and finally in Texas. With each withdrawal, he created a digital breadcrumb. Every transaction was a ping on a map, a time-stamped record of his location. Law enforcement, monitoring the card's activity, began to close in. They tracked his movements across the country, a ghost suddenly made visible by a trail of $20 bills. They had surveillance photos of his rental car at the ATMs. They knew his route. The net was tightening around a man who had, for years, been completely invisible. On March 13, 2012, in the parking lot of a hotel in Lufkin, Texas, a police officer noticed a car backing out of a spot and then pulling back in. It was a minor, suspicious movement, but enough to warrant a look. The officer ran the plates of the white Ford Focus and discovered it was a rental. When he pulled the car over, he found Israel Keyes behind the wheel. Inside the car, they found a disturbing collection of items, including Samantha Koenig's debit card and cell phone. The phantom had been caught. In custody, Keyes began to confess, not just to Koenig's murder, but to a string of other killings across the country that had long been cold cases. He revealed the existence of his kill kits and the terrifying scope of his murderous career. Israel Keyes, the man who built his entire criminal enterprise on the principle of untraceability, was brought down by the oldest motive in the book, greed. His meticulous planning, his years of discipline, all of it was rendered meaningless by his inability to resist using a stolen debit card. The digital trail he left was not a complex one hidden in metadata. It was a simple, blatant series of bank transactions that led investigators right to his door. In December 2012, like Maury Travis before him, Keyes committed suicide in his jail cell, taking the full, horrifying truth of his crimes with him to the grave. Whether it's a map generated online or withdrawal from an ATM, the digital world offers countless ways for a killer to trip up. But long before the advent of the internet, murderers were making equally foolish mistakes in the physical world. The act of disposing of a body, the most critical part of covering one's tracks, is often where the most gruesome and case-breaking errors are made. This brings us to the clumsy cleanup, where a killer's attempt to hide their crime only serves to announce it to the world. In the early 1980s, London was being stalked by a different kind of killer. This was not a predator who hunted on the streets, but one who lured his victims back to his home. He targeted young, vulnerable men, often homeless or unemployed, offering them a drink, a meal, or a place to stay for the night. His name was Dennis Nilsen, a seemingly unremarkable civil servant. Nilsen's apartments, first at 195 Melrose Avenue and later at 23 Cranley Gardens, were chambers of horror. He would strangle his victims and then, in a bizarre and disturbing ritual, he would keep their bodies for days or even weeks, bathing them, dressing them, and talking to them. He was a necrophile, a man who sought companionship from the dead. But this gruesome cohabitation created a practical problem: what to do with the bodies. At his first address, which had a garden, he would dismember the corpses and burn them on a bonfire, burying the remaining fragments under the floorboards. It was a horrific, but for a time, effective method of disposal. When he moved to the top-floor attic apartment at Cranley Gardens, he lost access to the garden. He had to devise a new method. This is where his attempt at a cleanup became his downfall. His new plan was as disgusting as it was idiotic. He would dismember the bodies in his bathtub and then attempt to flush the smaller pieces of flesh and bone down the toilet. It was a plan doomed to fail. The plumbing of a residential apartment building is not designed to handle human remains. In early 1983, the drains at 23 Cranley Gardens began to back up. Nilsen and other tenants complained to the landlord about the slow drainage and a foul, persistent odor. The landlord called a drain clearing company. A plumber named Michael Catron arrived to investigate the blockage. When he opened a drain cover at the side of the building, he made a sickening discovery. The pipe was packed with a gray, fleshy substance and small bones that looked suspiciously human. Catron, horrified, alerted the police. That evening, Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. arrived at the scene. He looked at the contents of the drain and knew immediately he was dealing with a homicide. His first thought was that a tenant may have tried to flush away a single dismembered victim. The truth was far more horrifying. When DCIJ went to confront the tenant of the top-floor flat, the source of the blockage, he was met at the door by Dennis Nilsen himself. When asked about the drains, Nilsen feigned ignorance. But the smell of decomposition in the apartment was overwhelming. And as Jay was about to leave, Nilsen, in a moment of strange resignation, cracked. He casually asked the detective, "Are we talking about one body or two?" He then calmly confessed to having human remains stored in his apartment. In his wardrobe, police found 2 plastic bags containing the dismembered parts of his most recent victims. Nilsen proceeded to confess to as many as 15 murders, matter-of-factly detailing his years of killing. His capture was a direct result of his own monumentally stupid disposal method. The idea that one could simply flush multiple dismembered bodies down a toilet without consequence is beyond foolish. It's almost childlike in its naivety. He had quite literally flushed his freedom away. His attempt to clean up his mess had served as a giant, stinking arrow pointing directly to his front door. Nilsen's mistake was one of flawed logic and a complete disregard for basic plumbing. A few years later, across the Atlantic in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, another serial killer's gruesome activities would be exposed by a similarly clumsy and odorous cleanup, though his discovery would come about in a far more dramatic fashion. Jeffrey Dahmer was, like Nilsen, a quiet predator who lured young men back to his apartment. His crimes, however, descended into even deeper levels of depravity, including cannibalism and twisted attempts to create mindless zombies by drilling into his victims' skulls. His apartment, number 213 at the Oxford Apartments, was a veritable museum of horror. For years, Dahmer operated with impunity. His neighbors complained about foul odors and the sound of power tools at odd hours, but their concerns were largely dismissed. He was a master of deflecting suspicion, of presenting a quiet, harmless facade to the world. But his world of horror was becoming increasingly difficult to contain. His method of disposal was as gruesome as his crimes. He would dismember his victims in his bathtub, dissolve their flesh in a 57-gallon drum of acid, and boil their heads to preserve the skulls. The smell was, at times, overpowering, a stench of death and chemicals that permeated the apartment building. On the night of July 22, 1991, Dahmer's carefully constructed world fell apart. He had brought a man named Tracy Edwards back to his apartment, placed a handcuff on one of his wrists, and threatened him with a knife. But Edwards was not a passive victim. He saw his opportunity, fought back, and managed to escape from the apartment, running into the street with one handcuff still dangling from his wrist. He flagged down a police car. He told the officers a bizarre story about a weirdo who had tried to kill him. The police, perhaps skeptical, agreed to accompany Edwards back to the apartment to retrieve the key for the handcuff. This was the moment of truth. Dahmer's private abattoir was about to be exposed to the outside world. When Dahmer answered the door, he was calm and cooperative, the picture of innocence. But the officers were immediately struck by two things: the horrific, overpowering stench emanating from the apartment, and the sight of a large knife on the bedroom floor. As one officer went to investigate, he opened a bedside table drawer and found a collection of gruesome Polaroid photographs. The photos depicted dismembered bodies in various poses, documenting every stage of Dahmer's ghastly ritual. The officer, in shock, reportedly said to his partner, "These are real." The game was up. A struggle ensued, and Dahmer was subdued and arrested. A subsequent search of the apartment revealed the full extent of his depravity. There were severed heads in the refrigerator and freezer, skulls in a closet, and the large blue drum in the corner filled with acid and the dissolving remains of several victims. The clumsy, smelly evidence of his crimes was everywhere. Dahmer's mistake was not a single act, but a cascade of them. He had become so comfortable in his horrific routine that he had grown sloppy. The overwhelming smell, the blatant evidence left around the apartment, and, most critically, his failure to successfully subdue his final victim, all of it pointed to a killer whose control was slipping. Like Nilsson, his attempt at a cleanup was a failure. The acid and the boiling could not contain the stench of death, a smell that should have been a red flag long before his capture. Both men, in their isolated worlds of murder, had lost all perspective. They had become so accustomed to the gore and the odor that they failed to realize how utterly abnormal and suspicious it would seem to anyone else. Their messy, gruesome secrets were simply too big to hide. This loss of perspective often goes hand in hand with a burgeoning ego. As a killer gets away with more crimes, a sense of invincibility can set in. This can lead to a dangerous compulsion, not just to taunt the police from afar, but to boast about their dark deeds to those around them. This need to be recognized, to have their terrible power acknowledged, brings us to our next fatal mistake: bragging and confiding in the wrong people. In the mid-1960s, Tucson, Arizona was a sun-drenched, sleepy town. But beneath the surface, a dark subculture was emerging among its youth, and at its center was a charismatic but deeply disturbed young man named Charles Schmid. He was short and athletic, but he went to bizarre lengths to alter his appearance, stuffing his boots with rags and tin cans to appear taller and dyeing his hair a stark black. He was known to his friends and followers as Smitty. He was a smooth talker, a storyteller, a figure of fascination for a group of disaffected teenagers who hung around the diners and drive-ins of Speedway Boulevard. He projected an aura of danger and excitement, and they were drawn to it like moths to a flame. But Schmid's stories were not just tales of teenage rebellion, they were confessions to murder.
Schmid craved attention and adoration. He wanted to be seen as a powerful, almost mythical figure. And in his twisted mind, the ultimate expression of that power was the act of killing. In 1964, he murdered a 15-year-old girl named Eileen Rowe. A year later, he escalated, murdering two sisters, Gretchen and Wendy Fritz.
For most killers, the immediate aftermath of a murder is a time of fear and secrecy. The primary goal is to distance oneself from the crime, to create an alibi, to ensure no one knows. Charles Schmid did the exact opposite. He couldn't resist bragging about what he had done. He saw his murders not as shameful secrets, but as trophies to be displayed. He began to talk. He confided in his inner circle of friends, spinning the gruesome details of the murders into thrilling narratives. He described how he had killed the girls, where he had buried them. He treated the act of taking 3 young lives as a point of pride, a source of street credibility. His friends, caught between fear and a morbid fascination, listened. But talking wasn't enough for Schmid. His ego demanded a grander gesture. In an act of almost unbelievable stupidity, he took some of his friends out to the desolate desert landscape outside of Tucson. He led them to the shallow, makeshift graves and showed them the bodies of his victims. He was giving them a private tour of his handiwork. This was his fatal mistake. He had transformed his friends from confidants into direct witnesses to his crimes. He had given them knowledge that was too terrible to keep. He believed his charisma and the fear he inspired would be enough to ensure their silence. He fundamentally misjudged the conscience and the capacity for self-preservation in others. One of his friends, a young man named Richard Bruns, was horrified by what he had seen and heard. The weight of the secret became too much to bear. Terrified of Schmid, but equally terrified of being an accessory to murder, Bruns eventually went to the police and told them everything. He told them Schmid's stories, and he told them where the bodies were buried. Based on Bruns's confession, police arrested Charles Schmid. His carefully crafted persona as the cool, dangerous anti-hero shattered. He was exposed as a pathetic, narcissistic killer whose need for an audience was his undoing. The media dubbed him the Pied Piper of Tucson, a reference to his strange hold over the city's youth. Schmid's case is a stark illustration of how a killer's ego can become their own worst enemy. He didn't need to tell anyone. He could have remained a suspect, a person of interest. But his desperate craving for notoriety, his need to be seen as a somebody in the eyes of his followers, led him to hand-deliver the evidence against himself. He talked and he showed, and in doing so, he signed his own death warrant. He was convicted and eventually murdered in prison, a final violent end for a man who built his identity on violence. Schmid's motivation was psychological, a need for status. But sometimes the impulse to profit from a murder is just as strong and just as foolish. The temptation to take a victim's possessions, especially their money, can create a direct and easily traceable link to the crime. This brings us to our next mistake, the telltale transaction, where a killer's greed leaves a blatant paper or digital trail. In the year 2000, in Wrocław, Poland, the body of a man named Dariusz Januszewski was pulled from the Oder River. He had been starved and tortured before being killed. The investigation into his murder was intense, but ultimately fruitless. The case had no witnesses, no suspects, and no clear motive. It quickly went cold, another unsolved file in a cabinet. For years, the case remained dormant. Then, in 2007, a detective on the Cold Case Squad, Jacek Wroblewski, received a tip. The tipster suggested he read a recently published novel titled Amok. The book, written by a Polish author and intellectual named Christian Bala, was a dark, postmodern thriller. As Wroblewski began to read, he felt a growing sense of unease. The fictional murder described a shocking and uncanny resemblance to the real-life murder of Dariusz Janiszewski. The details were too specific, too similar to be a coincidence. The fictional victim was killed in a manner that mirrored the real crime. The detective was convinced that the author, Christian Bala, knew something about the murder. This was, in itself, a strange and arrogant mistake. Writing a novel that mirrors your own unsolved murder is a bold, almost literary form of taunting. But it was not the clue that would ultimately convict him. It was a far more common and foolish error, a mistake driven by simple greed. As investigators delved into Bala's life, they began to look at the victim's life as well. They discovered that just days after Janiszewski disappeared in 2000, his cell phone had been sold in an online auction. This was long before the murder was even discovered, at a time when he was still just a missing person. The police traced the online sale. The seller of the phone was none other than Christian Bala. It was a direct, tangible link between the killer and his victim. Bala, a man of supposed intellect, had committed a murder and then, just 4 days later, had logged onto the internet and sold the victim's phone for a small amount of cash. It was an act of incredible short-sightedness. This discovery re-energized the investigation. The cell phone sale was the concrete evidence they needed to anchor their suspicions about the novel. They had a motive as well. Bala's ex-wife had been seeing Janiszewski, a classic crime of passion fueled by jealousy. The pieces were all falling into place. The similarities in the novel, once just a curiosity, now looked like a confession. The prosecution argued that Bala, in his intellectual arrogance, believed he could commit the perfect crime and then subtly boast about it in his fiction, a twisted form of artistic expression. But it was his less than artistic need for a quick buck that truly sealed his fate. Christian Bala was arrested and put on trial. The combination of the eerie novel and the damning cell phone transaction was enough for a conviction. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The intellectual who tried to write himself into the annals of crime fiction ended up writing himself into a prison cell. His story serves as a perfect example of how the intellectual and the idiotic can coexist within a single criminal mind. The desire to create a complex, literary puzzle was completely undermined by a simple, greedy, and easily traceable online sale. This compulsion to take something from the victim, whether it's a phone, a wallet, or a car, is a recurring theme. It's a fundamental miscalculation, an underestimation of how thoroughly modern finance and commerce are tracked. But as foolish as leaving a financial trail is, there is an even more blatant, more damning mistake a killer can make. It is the mistake of being caught in the most incriminating position imaginable, with the body itself. For a murderer, the moments after the crime are the most critical. The primary objective is to dispose of the evidence, most notably the victim's body, as quickly and discreetly as possible. It is a period of high risk and high tension. Yet some killers, through a combination of bad luck, bad planning, or sheer incompetence, manage to get caught during this most crucial phase. This brings us to the ultimate blunder: being found with an inconvenient corpse. Joe Rifkin was a serial killer who haunted the highways of New York in the early 1990s. He preyed on sex workers and drug addicts, women on the margins of society whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed. He was a prolific killer, ultimately confessing to the murders of 17 women. Rifkin was a landscape gardener, a seemingly ordinary man who harbored a deep-seated rage. He would pick up his victims, strangle them, and then dismember their bodies, scattering the parts across the tri-state area. For 4 years, he managed to evade capture, his crimes a string of unsolved body parts cases that baffled police. By June of 1993, Rifkin was becoming increasingly reckless. His final victim was a woman named Tiffany Bresciani. After killing her, he placed her body in a blue oil drum in his mother's garage, where it began to decompose in the summer heat. The smell was becoming a problem. He knew he had to get rid of the body. On June 27th, he loaded the heavy drum into the back of his Mazda pickup truck and set out in the early morning hours, planning to dump it in a remote location. But he made a simple, stupid mistake before he even left his driveway. His truck didn't have a rear license plate. It was a minor vehicle code violation, but at 4 a.m., it was enough to attract attention. As he was driving on the Southern State Parkway on Long Island, 2 state troopers on patrol noticed the missing plate. They signaled for the pickup truck to pull over. For the troopers, it was a routine traffic stop. For Joel Rifkin, it was the end of the line. Instead of pulling over, he panicked. He hit the gas and a high-speed chase ensued. The chase reached speeds of over 100 miles per hour, a desperate, futile attempt to escape. It ended when Rifkin lost control of his truck and crashed into a utility pole. The troopers approached the wrecked vehicle cautiously. As they got closer, they were hit by an overpowering, sickeningly sweet odor of decomposition emanating from the back of the truck. In the truck bed, they found the source of the smell, the large blue drum containing the decomposing body of Tiffany Bresciani. Joel Rifkin, the man responsible for a string of unsolved murders, was caught red-handed, not through detective work, but because he forgot to put a license plate on his truck. It was an astoundingly careless oversight for a man in the process of disposing of a body. In custody, Rifkin quickly began to confess, calmly and methodically detailing his 4-year killing spree. The traffic stop had unraveled the entire twisted saga. His case is a textbook example of how a killer's focus on the macabre details of their crime can lead them to neglect the most basic, common-sense precautions. He was so preoccupied with the body in the drum that he forgot about the license plate on the bumper. This type of capture, being caught with the literal evidence of the crime, is not as rare as one might think. A decade earlier, on the other side of the country, another prolific and terrifying serial killer was brought down in a remarkably similar fashion. His name was Randy Kraft, but he would become known by a more chilling moniker, the Scorecard Killer. Kraft was a monster hiding in plain sight. He was an intelligent, successful computer consultant from a good family. He was also a sadistic predator who, for over a decade, drugged, tortured, and murdered young men, many of them hitchhiking Marines from the bases in Southern California. He is suspected of killing as many as 67 people. Kraft was meticulous in his cruelty. He would often take photos of his victims and kept a cryptic, coded list that investigators believe was a record of his kills. This list, which contained abbreviated references to his victims, would later earn him his nickname. He was a highly organized and disciplined killer, which allowed him to operate for so long without being caught. But on the night of May 14, 1983, his discipline failed him. 2 California Highway Patrol officers were monitoring traffic on the San Diego Freeway in Mission Viejo. They observed a brown Toyota Celica weaving erratically across the lanes. Suspecting a drunk driver, they pulled the car over. Behind the wheel was Randy Kraft. The officers asked him to step out of the vehicle to perform a field sobriety test. As he did, one of the officers shone the flashlight into the passenger side of the car. What he saw was shocking. Slumped in the passenger seat was a young man, clearly deceased. He was a 25-year-old Marine named Terry Gambrell. Kraft had just murdered him and was, presumably, on his way to dispose of the body. He had been so intoxicated, likely from the same drugs he used on his victims, that his driving had become dangerously erratic. It was this simple act of drunk driving that brought his long and horrific reign of terror to an immediate and shocking end. When police searched the trunk of Kraft's car, they made another chilling discovery.
They found the coded scorecard, his meticulous list of death. It was the key that would allow investigators to link him to dozens of unsolved murders and missing person cases across multiple states. It was a ledger of his evil, a document he had foolishly kept with him. Both Rifkin and Kraft, two of the most prolific serial killers of their time, were captured in the most incriminating way possible. They were caught driving with a dead body in their car. Their downfall was not the result of a complex investigation, but of a simple, routine traffic stop. Their arrogance and carelessness, whether it was a missing license plate or a night of drunk driving, literally delivered them and the evidence of their latest crime directly into the hands of the law. Being caught with a body is perhaps the most blatant mistake a killer can make, but there is another, more psychologically complex error that has led to the downfall of many a murderer: the compulsion to return to the scene of the crime. It's a trope we often see in fiction, but it is a very real phenomenon, driven by a mixture of nostalgia, a desire to relive the thrill, or a need to check on the state of their handiwork. For police, it can be a powerful investigative tool. In the late 1980s, the city of Rochester, New York, was gripped by fear. A serial killer was preying on sex workers, dumping their bodies along the banks of the Genesee River. The media dubbed him the Genesee River Killer. The man behind the killings was Arthur Shawcross, a man who had already served time for the manslaughter of 2 children in the 1970s. After his parole, Shawcross had moved to Rochester and began killing again, this time targeting adult women. He was a deeply disturbed individual, his crimes marked by extreme brutality. For nearly 2 years, he eluded capture, his victim count rising into the double digits. The police were under immense pressure to stop the killings. Investigators noticed a pattern in where the bodies were being discovered. They began to believe that the killer had a connection to these locations and might be drawn back to them. It was a psychological gamble, but they decided to set up surveillance in an area where one of the victims had recently been found, near a bridge over the Genesee River. Their hunch paid off. As they watched the area, they observed a man who kept returning to the bridge, stopping his car to look down at the water below where a body had been recovered. His behavior was suspicious. It was more than just morbid curiosity. It seemed proprietary, as if he were visiting a monument he had created. The surveillance team jotted down the license plate number of the man's blue Dodge Omni. They ran the plates and the name came back: Arthur Shawcross. A quick background check revealed his shocking criminal history, including his prior convictions for killing children. Suddenly, they had a prime suspect. This was the crucial break they needed. Shawcross's compulsion to revisit his crime scene, to gaze upon the location where he had exerted his ultimate power, had placed him directly in the police's line of sight. It was a mistake born of a twisted sense of pride and ownership over his horrific acts. Police put Shawcross under 24-hour surveillance. They followed him, watched him, and built their case. They eventually observed him urinating on the same bridge, a final act of contemptuous ownership of the spot. The evidence mounted, and he was eventually arrested. During his interrogation, Shawcross confessed in rambling, graphic detail to the murders of 11 women. He even led investigators to the body of a 12th victim they had not yet discovered. He was convicted and sentenced to 250 years in prison, where he died in 2008. Arthur Shawcross was not a criminal genius. He was a brutal, disorganized killer driven by compulsion. And it was one of those compulsions, the need to return, to look, to remember, that led police right to him. He had created a landmark of his own evil, and like a tourist, he couldn't resist going back for another look. In doing so, he allowed the hunters to spot their prey in his own unnatural habitat. Returning to the scene of the crime is a psychological blunder. But perhaps the most devastating mistake a killer can make is a practical one: failing to ensure their victim is actually dead. The testimony of a surviving witness is the most powerful evidence imaginable.
a living voice that can speak directly to the horrors it endured. This is the story of a killer who made that very mistake, and the remarkable young woman who brought him to justice. In 1984, the Tampa Bay area of Florida was being terrorized by a serial rapist and murderer. For months, an unknown assailant was abducting, assaulting, and killing women. The community was on edge. Police had few leads, and the killer was becoming bolder with each attack. The man responsible was a predator named Bobby Joe Long. Long's method was to cruise the streets in his car, looking for vulnerable women. He would abduct them, take them back to his apartment, and subject them to horrific ordeals that could last for hours or days before ultimately murdering them. He was careful, leaving little evidence behind, and his victim count was rising. On the night of November 3, 1984, Long targeted his next victim. It was a 17-year-old girl named Lisa McVeigh. He kidnapped her and took her to his apartment, where he held her captive for over 26 hours. For Lisa, it was a terrifying ordeal that seemed endless. But even in those dark moments, she remained alert, observing details and determined to survive. Lisa made a conscious decision to be the best possible witness she could be. Despite being blindfolded for most of the ordeal, she made a mental inventory of every detail her other senses could pick up. She felt the texture of the carpet. She listened to the sounds outside the apartment. She paid attention to the turns he made in the car. Most importantly, she talked to him, using a form of reverse psychology to build a strange rapport, to make herself seem like a person to him, not just an object. Her strategy worked. In a decision that would be his undoing, Bobby Joe Long decided to let her go. He drove her to a remote location and released her. It was the single biggest mistake of his criminal career. He had underestimated the resilience, the intelligence, and the memory of his victim. He had left a living witness. As soon as she was free, Lisa McVeigh went to the police. What followed was one of the most remarkable witness debriefings in criminal history. She provided a flood of information. She remembered details about the interior of his car, the red shag carpeting in his apartment, the fact that he had a television with a specific type of knob. She remembered seeing the name Magnum on his dashboard when her blindfold slipped for a moment. She recalled tiny, seemingly insignificant details that would prove to be crucial. She remembered the sound of an alarm clock with a radio station that announced the time every 15 minutes. She remembered him stopping at an ATM. She even remembered the route they took, recounting the number of left and right turns from her memory. This wealth of information was a goldmine for investigators. They were able to use her detailed account to slowly but surely piece together a profile of their suspect. They narrowed down the search area based on the time it took to drive from the abduction site. The detail about the Magnum on the dashboard led them to the Dodge Magnum car model. The ATM stop allowed them to check bank records. Slowly, methodically, they built a circle around their suspect. The pieces all pointed to one man, Bobby Joe Long. When they put him under surveillance, they saw him driving a Dodge Magnum. When they finally arrested him, they found the red shag carpet in his apartment, just as Lisa had described. Lisa McVeigh's testimony was the cornerstone of the prosecution. Her incredible memory and bravery in the face of unimaginable terror directly led to the capture of a man who had murdered at least 10 women. Bobby Joe Long was convicted and sentenced to death. He was executed in 2019. The story of Lisa McVeigh is a powerful testament to the strength of the human spirit. But it is also the ultimate story of a killer's stupid mistake. Bobby Joe Long, a man who had successfully gotten away with multiple murders, made the fatal error of believing he could release a witness and remain free.
He failed to realize that the most dangerous piece of evidence he could possibly leave behind was not a fingerprint or a fiber, but a living, breathing person with a story to tell. Long's mistake was a solo act of misjudgment. But sometimes a killer's downfall is not their own mistake, but the mistake of involving someone else in their dark world. The introduction of an accomplice adds a volatile and unpredictable human element to any crime. Loyalty is fragile, secrets are heavy, and fear can turn a partner in crime into a star witness for the prosecution. This brings us to the misplaced trust in an accomplice and the story of two of the most notorious killers in British history. In the 1960s, a dark cloud hung over the industrial city of Manchester, England. A series of child disappearances had plunged the region into a state of fear and dread. The children were vanishing, seemingly without a trace. The perpetrators of these horrific crimes were a couple whose names would become synonymous with pure evil: Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Brady was a nihilistic, sadistic psychopath obsessed with Nazi Germany and philosophical treatises on power. Hindley, his besotted partner, was a willing and active participant in his depraved fantasies. Together, they abducted, sexually assaulted, and murdered 5 children and teenagers between 1963 and 1965, burying their victims in shallow graves on the desolate Saddleworth Moor. They were a self-contained unit of evil, their horrific secret binding them together. They documented their crimes in writing and in a chilling audio recording of one of their victims being tortured. They believed they were superior beings, above the law and morality. For over 2 years, they operated in secrecy, their crimes a private world of horror shared only between the two of them. But their insular world was about to be breached. In October 1965, they decided to involve a third person. Myra Hindley's brother-in-law, a 17-year-old named David Smith, was a troubled young man who looked up to the charismatic and domineering Ian Brady. Brady, in his arrogance, saw Smith as a potential protege, someone he could mold in his own twisted image. On the night of October 6th, Hindley and Brady lured their final victim, a 17-year-old apprentice engineer named Edward Evans, back to their home. They invited David Smith over, telling him they had some liquor for him. When Smith arrived, he became an unwilling witness to a murder. He watched in horror as Ian Brady brutally attacked Edward Evans with a hatchet and then strangled him with an electrical cord. Brady, in a display of supreme arrogance, was initiating Smith into his world, expecting him to be impressed or at least complicit. He had made a catastrophic miscalculation. David Smith was not a fellow psychopath. He was a young man who, despite his own troubles, was utterly horrified by the cold-blooded violence he had just witnessed. He played along, helping them clean up and move the body, terrified that he would be their next victim. But as soon as he was able to get away, he ran home to his wife, Myra's sister, Maureen. In a state of panic and revulsion, he told her everything he had seen. Together, they made the decision that would end the reign of terror of the Moors murderers. They went to the police. At 6 o'clock the next morning, David Smith led detectives to Brady and Hindley's house. When police entered, they found the body of Edward Evans in an upstairs room, just as Smith had described. Brady and Hindley were arrested. The secret world they had built for themselves had been shattered by the one person they had chosen to let in. During the search of their home, police found the incriminating evidence that would link them to the other missing children. They found the photographs, the notebooks, and, most damningly, a left luggage ticket that led them to a suitcase containing the horrifying audio tape of their 10-year-old victim, Leslie Ann Downey, pleading for her life. The involvement of David Smith was the fatal mistake. Brady, in his godlike self-perception, believed he could control and corrupt anyone. He failed to understand that his own depravity was not a universal trait. He trusted an accomplice who did not share his monstrous nature.
And that accomplice, driven by fear and a basic sense of human decency, turned him in. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley were convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Their case stands as a chilling reminder of the dangers of an expanding conspiracy. A secret shared between two people is a precarious thing. A secret shared among three is almost certain to be revealed. The human conscience, even in a troubled individual like David Smith, proved to be a more powerful force than the bond of their evil. Misplaced trust in a person is one form of fatal error. Misplaced faith in one's own cleverness is another, especially when it comes to matters of greed. For some killers, the murder itself is only the first step. The second is to profit from it, often through forgery or fraud. This attempt to secure a financial windfall can be the source of the most careless and easily spotted mistakes. This brings us to a man who was not just a killer, but the most prolific serial killer in British history. A man whose greed finally exposed his decades of secret slaughter. Dr. Harold Shipman was, for all intents and purposes, a pillar of his community. He was a trusted and well-liked general practitioner in the town of Hyde, Greater Manchester. For over 2 decades, his patients, mostly elderly women who lived alone, adored him. He was the friendly family doctor who made house calls and always had a comforting word. But behind this mask of care and compassion was a cold, calculating, and prolific murderer. Shipman's method was simple and chilling. He would visit his elderly patients at their homes and, under the guise of providing medical care, would administer a lethal overdose of diamorphine, a medical-grade heroin. He would then alter their medical records to reflect a plausible natural cause of death, signing the death certificate himself. He was the one who killed them, and he was the one who certified their deaths. It was a nearly perfect system for murder. For years, he operated with impunity. The death rate among his patients was abnormally high, but he was rarely questioned. He was, after all, a respected doctor, and his patients were elderly. Their deaths, on their own, did not raise alarms. It is estimated that he murdered at least 218 people, and possibly many more, over a period of more than 20 years. Shipman was not killing for the thrill or for any discernible sadistic pleasure. His motives remain somewhat opaque, but it seems he was driven by a God complex, a desire to hold the power of life and death in his hands. He was the ultimate authority, deciding when his patients' lives would end. And for a long time, he was content with just the power. But in 1998, after decades of getting away with murder, he made a mistake. It was a mistake born of pure, unadulterated greed. One of his patients was an 81-year-old woman named Kathleen Grundy. She was the former mayoress of Hyde, a wealthy and healthy woman. On June 24, 1998, she died suddenly. Dr. Shipman was the last person to see her alive. He signed her death certificate, listing her cause of death as old age. Everything seemed routine. But then, a new will for Mrs. Grundy mysteriously surfaced. This new will was a shocking departure from her previous one. It left her entire substantial estate worth nearly £400,000 to one person, her beloved physician, Dr. Harold Shipman. The will was crudely typed and full of errors. It also contained a clause explicitly disinheriting her own children. The beneficiary of this suspicious document was also the man who had certified her death. It was an act of such breathtaking arrogance and carelessness that it practically screamed foul play. The person who first saw the will was Kathleen Grundy's daughter, a solicitor named Angela Woodruff. She was not just a grieving daughter, she was a trained legal professional. She knew immediately that the will was a forgery. It was poorly constructed, the signature looked suspect, and the entire premise of her mother disinheriting her family in favor of her doctor was preposterous. This was the fatal flaw. After more than 200 successful, secret murders, Harold Shipman got greedy. He wasn't content with just the power over life and death. He wanted the money as well. and his attempt to secure it was laughably amateurish. He had used a typewriter that was easily traced back to his medical practice. The signature was a clumsy fake. He had fundamentally underestimated the intelligence and suspicion of his victim's family. Angela Woodruff went to the police. The investigation began not as a murder inquiry, but as an investigation into a forged will. But as police looked into the circumstances of Kathleen Grundy's death, the red flags began to multiply. They decided to exhume her body. The autopsy revealed the truth. Her body contained lethal levels of diamorphine. She had been murdered. The investigation then widened as police began to look at the sheer number of death certificates Shipman had signed over the years and the number of his patients who had been cremated, conveniently destroying any evidence of foul play. The pattern that emerged was horrifying. A statistical analysis showed an impossibly high death rate among his elderly female patients who lived alone. The police began a massive inquiry, exhuming more bodies and uncovering more evidence of lethal overdoses. The kindly family doctor was exposed as a monster. Harold Shipman was tried and convicted in 2000 for the murders of 15 of his patients, though an official inquiry later confirmed he was responsible for hundreds more. He committed suicide in prison in 2004. His downfall was not brought about by a medical board or a suspicious colleague, but by his own clumsy, greedy attempt to forge a will. After decades of perfect crimes, a simple, poorly typed document was the piece of paper that unraveled it all. Shipman's forged will is a stark example of a careless paper trail. In the digital age, we think of trails as being electronic. But for much of criminal history, a simple piece of stationery or a handwritten note could be just as damning. This brings us to a killer from a much earlier era. A man whose depravity was matched only by his foolishness in choosing his writing paper. Albert Fish was one of the most monstrous criminals of the 20th century. He was a sadomasochist, a cannibal, and a child murderer who operated in the New York area in the 1920s and 30s. He was an unassuming, elderly-looking man who appeared harmless, a grandfatherly figure who used his benign appearance to lure his victims and their parents into a false sense of security. His crimes were so horrific they are difficult to comprehend. He inflicted unimaginable torture on himself and others. He claimed to have hundreds of victims, though only a few were ever confirmed. He was a true bogeyman, a predator who haunted the fringes of society. In 1928, Fish, using the alias Frank Howard, responded to a newspaper ad placed by a man named Edward Budd who was looking for work. Fish visited the Budd family at their home, charmed them with his grandfatherly demeanor, and offered Edward a non-existent job on a farm. A week later, he returned with a proposition. He invited the Bud's 10-year-old daughter, Grace, to attend a children's birthday party he claimed his sister was hosting. The Budds, completely taken in by this seemingly kind old man, agreed to let her go. Grace Budd walked away with Albert Fish and was never seen again. For 6 years, her disappearance was a complete mystery, a heartbreaking cold case for her family and the police. Fish had taken Grace to a vacant house in Westchester County, murdered her, and cannibalized her remains. He had gotten away with it completely. There were no witnesses, no evidence, and the trail was cold. He could have and should have remained silent. But like so many other killers with a colossal ego, he could not resist the urge to relive his crime and to inflict further pain. In November 1934, 6 years after the murder, Grace's mother, Delia Budd, received a letter. The letter was anonymous, obscene, and filled with a graphic, horrifying account of what had happened to her daughter. The author described, in stomach-churning detail, how he had killed and eaten her. It was an act of pure, sadistic cruelty, a final twist of the knife for a grieving family. But in writing this letter, Albert Fish made a stupid, fatal mistake. The letter was his undoing, not because of its content, but because of the stationery he chose to write it on. The paper had a distinctive emblem in the corner, a logo for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. When the terrified Budd family turned the letter over to the police, this small logo became the single most important clue in the 6-year-old case. It was a tangible link, a starting point in a case that had none. Investigators began the methodical police work of tracking down the source of the stationery. They discovered that the Chauffeurs Association had a rooming house where many of its members lived or received mail. The superintendent of the building recognized the description of the man who had taken Grace Budd years earlier. He told police that a man matching the description, known for his odd habits and for muttering to himself, had recently been living there. His name was Albert Fish. The superintendent knew where Fish was currently living. The police had their man. They went to his new boarding house and waited. When Fish returned, he was arrested. The bogeyman who had haunted New York for years was finally in custody. During his interrogation, he confessed not just to the murder of Grace Budd, but to a litany of other horrific crimes. An X-ray later revealed he had inserted dozens of needles into his own pelvic region, a testament to his extreme masochism. He was tried, convicted, and executed in the electric chair in 1936. The capture of one of America's most depraved killers was a direct result of his own idiotic choice of writing material. He had a compulsion to taunt his victim's family, but he was too careless to do it on a blank piece of paper. That small, seemingly insignificant logo on the stationery was the thread that led police through the labyrinth of his madness and directly to his door. It was a classic, old-world example of a paper trail leading to justice. Leaving a paper trail is a mistake of carelessness, but there is a level of arrogance so profound, so baffling, that it transcends mere carelessness and enters the realm of the truly stupid. This is the mistake of a killer who makes no attempt to hide their identity. A killer who, in a moment of supreme hubris, actually uses their real name in the commission of their crime. In the summer of 1946, post-war Britain was captivated and horrified by a killer who became known in the press as the blonde-haired killer. He was a handsome, charming man who preyed on women, a predator who used his good looks and suave demeanor to lure his victims to their deaths. His name was Neville Heath. Heath was a former Royal Air Force pilot with a history of fraud and a dishonorable discharge. He was a pathological liar and a sadist, a man who craved a life of luxury and excitement that he couldn't legitimately afford. He moved through the hotels and bars of London, a con man with a dark, violent secret. On the night of June 20th, 1946, Heath was having drinks with a 32-year-old film extra named Marjorie Gardner. They were seen leaving together and heading back to the Pembridge Court Hotel in Notting Hill Gate. Heath had checked into the hotel earlier, and he had done so under his own real name. The next morning, a chambermaid entered the hotel room and discovered a horrific scene. Marjorie Gardner's body was on the bed. She had been brutally whipped and suffocated. It was a crime of shocking, sadistic violence. And the man who had rented the room, the prime suspect, had helpfully provided his real name and a forwarding address to the hotel staff. This was a mistake of such astounding arrogance, it's hard to comprehend. He had committed a brutal murder in a hotel room that was registered to him. He made no attempt to use an alias, no effort to cover his tracks. It was as if he believed he was so charming, so untouchable, that the normal rules of investigation simply didn't apply to him. Heath, of course, had fled, but the police had his name. His description was circulated, and a nationwide manhunt began. Instead of going into hiding, Heath traveled to the coastal resort town of Bournemouth. There, he checked into another hotel, this time under the alias Group Captain Rupert Brooke, a name stolen from a famous war poet. In Bournemouth, he met his next victim, a 21-year-old former Women's Royal Naval Service officer named Doreen Marshall. He took her for a walk through the scenic Chine Gardens. She was never seen alive again. 2 days later, her body was found, partially submerged in a rhododendron bush. She had been subjected to even more horrific violence than his first victim. By this point, Heath was the most wanted man in Britain. He had the audacity to write a letter to the police, criticizing their investigation and offering his own analysis of the killer's psychological state, a classic narcissistic ploy. But his time was running out. He eventually returned to the hotel in Bournemouth where he had been staying as Captain Brooke. The hotel manager, recognizing him from the newspaper photos, had already alerted the police. They were waiting for him. When confronted, he tried to maintain his false identity, but the evidence was overwhelming. The man who had twice left a clear trail for police to follow was finally in custody. Neville Heath's crimes were solved with remarkable speed, not because of brilliant detective work, but because he made it so easy. Using his real name at the first crime scene was a gift to the investigators. It was an act of pure, unadulterated ego. He believed his own charm and lies were enough to protect him, a fatal miscalculation. His case illustrates a particular type of criminal narcissism, a belief that one is so special that the mundane details of identity and evidence are beneath them. He was a man playing a role, the debonair war hero, and he was so lost in his own fiction that he forgot the deadly reality of his actions. He was swiftly tried, convicted, and hanged, his handsome face becoming a mask for the foolish, arrogant killer he truly was. All the mistakes we have discussed so far, from the tangible clue to the digital misstep, were instrumental in bringing a killer to justice in their own time. But there is one final category of mistake that is different. It is the mistake a killer doesn't even know they are making. It is the act of leaving behind a clue that is invisible to the science of their day. A microscopic breadcrumb that will lie dormant for decades, waiting for technology to catch up. This is the story of how the crimes of the past are being solved by the science of the future. From 1974 to 1986, a shadow fell over the state of California. It was a single, terrifying predator who was responsible for at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries. He was known by many names as his crime spree evolved and moved across the state. The Visalia ransacker, the East Area rapist, the original Night Stalker. It was only decades later that DNA would confirm these were all the same man. For the purpose of his story, we will call him by the name he earned in his final, terrifying phase, the Golden State Killer. He was a meticulous and sadistic criminal. He would stalk his victims for weeks, learning their routines, their habits, the layout of their homes. He would break in at night, binding his victims and terrorizing them for hours. His cruelty and his ability to operate for so long without being identified made him one of the most feared and enigmatic criminals in American history. He was a phantom. He left few clues. He was skilled at avoiding detection, often wearing a mask and gloves. The investigation into his crimes was one of the largest and longest running in California history, but for decades it remained unsolved. The killer had vanished after his last known crime in 1986, leaving behind only a legacy of terror and a trove of cold cases. But he had made a mistake. It was an unavoidable mistake for a criminal of his time. In the course of his violent assaults, he had left behind his DNA. He had left his biological signature at the crime scenes in the form of semen and blood. In the 1970s and 80s, DNA technology as we know it did not exist. This evidence was collected and preserved, but its full potential could not be unlocked. The killer had, unknowingly, left a ticking time bomb of evidence. As the years turned into decades, forensic science underwent a revolution. The ability to create a DNA profile from crime scene evidence became a standard tool for law enforcement. The DNA from the various Golden State Killer crime scenes was analyzed, and it was confirmed that a single unknown male was responsible. His genetic profile was entered into CODIS, the national DNA database, but there was no match. The killer was not in the system. For a while, it seemed like another dead end. But then, a new and revolutionary investigative technique emerged: forensic genetic genealogy. This method involves taking the unknown DNA profile from a crime scene and uploading it to public, open-source genealogy websites. Websites where ordinary people upload their own DNA results to find relatives and build their family trees. The goal is not to find the killer himself, but to find a distant relative, a second or third cousin. From there, investigators, working with genealogists, can begin to build a family tree, working forwards and backwards in time, trying to identify a common ancestor, and then trace the descendants down to a person who fits the profile of the suspect, the right age, living in the right location at the time of the crimes. In 2017, a team of investigators, including the now famous Paul Holes, decided to try this new technique on the cold case of the Golden State Killer. They uploaded the killer's DNA profile to the genealogy website GEDmatch. They got a hit. They found a handful of people who shared a small amount of DNA with the killer, enough to suggest they were distant cousins. What followed was a monumental feat of genealogical research. They built a massive family tree, tracing the killer's lineage back to a set of great-great-great-grandparents from the 19th century. They then began to work their way forward, identifying every descendant, slowly and painstakingly narrowing down the pool of suspects. It was a process that took months of meticulous work. Eventually, they narrowed their focus to two men. One was ruled out. The other was a 72-year-old man named Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who had been fired in 1979 for shoplifting a can of dog repellent and a hammer. He lived in a quiet suburb of Sacramento, in the heart of the area where the East Area rapist had been most active. He fit the profile perfectly. The investigators needed to be sure. They put DeAngelo under surveillance. They collected a sample of his DNA from the door handle of his car, and later from a tissue he had discarded in a trash can. They sent the samples to the lab for comparison with the crime scene DNA. It was a perfect match. After 40 years, the Phantom had a name. On April 24, 2018, Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, was arrested at his home. The man who had terrorized a state for over a decade, the man who had committed what many thought was the perfect, unsolvable crime, was undone by a mistake he couldn't have even conceived of making. His mistake was simply committing his crimes. He had left behind the most fundamental part of himself, his genetic code, at a time when that code was still a secret language. He was a product of his era, and he was caught by the science of an era he never could have anticipated. He had been outsmarted not by a detective, but by the relentless march of time and scientific progress. In 2020, DeAngelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of murder and numerous kidnapping charges to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His capture was a landmark moment in criminal justice, a powerful demonstration that for some killers, the past is never truly buried. The stupid mistake they made was believing that their secrets would remain secret forever. From a piece of pajama fabric in 1910 to a strand of DNA in 2018, the story of justice is often the story of a criminal's error. We have journeyed through a gallery of gaffes, a museum of missteps, each one a testament to the fallibility of those who believe themselves to be infallible. We have seen how the most complex and terrifying criminal enterprises can be brought down by the simplest of human failings. What is the common thread that ties these 15 stories together? It is, in a word, hubris. It is the profound arrogance that allows a man to believe he can taunt the police without consequence, that he can drive drunk with a body in his passenger seat, that he can forge a will in his own name, or that he can boast of his murders to his friends. It is the ego that blinds them to the obvious, the narcissism that makes them underestimate the world around them. These killers are often portrayed as meticulous planners, and in the act of murder itself, they sometimes are. They plan the approach, the attack, the method of killing, but their planning often stops there. They fail to account for the mundane realities of life: the nosy neighbor, the observant patrol officer, the plumber fixing a clogged drain, the digital trail left by a simple transaction. They operate in a fantasy world of their own making, a world where they are the central, all-powerful character. In this world, they don't get parking tickets. Their accomplices don't have a conscience. Their victims don't survive. And the stationery they use is just paper. They are so consumed by the grandiosity of their dark deeds that they forget the small details that govern the rest of our lives. Moreover, these stories reveal that the path to justice is often not a straight line of brilliant deduction, but a messy, winding road paved with luck, perseverance, and the criminal's own self-destructive tendencies. It is the tedious work of checking every parking ticket, the intuition of a patrolman on a quiet night, the bravery of a witness who refused to be a statistic. And as technology continues to evolve, the potential for a killer to make a stupid mistake only grows. Today's murderer must contend not only with DNA and forensics, but with a world of ubiquitous surveillance cameras, GPS tracking in our phones, and the indelible memory of the internet. The number of ways to trip up, to leave a trace, to be seen is expanding exponentially. The myth of the master criminal, the untouchable genius, is a compelling fiction. But the truth is far more reassuring. The truth is that monsters are often fools. Their evil is not a sign of a superior intellect, but of a profound and pathetic character flaw. And more often than not, it is this very flaw, this gaping hole in their own humanity, that leads them directly into the light of justice. The next time you hear a story of a shocking crime, remember the tales we have explored today. Remember that behind the monstrous facade, there is often a simple, arrogant individual poised to make a mistake. And in that mistake, however small or stupid it may seem, lies the seed of their own undoing. For in the end, the most intricate lock a killer can devise is no match for the key they foolishly leave sitting on the doormat.